From the outside, the Hamiltons appeared untouchable, almost mythic in the way their presence loomed over the town. Their mansion wasn't just a house, it was a declaration of status, a monument to wealth and perfection carved in stone and glass. White pillars rose like watchful sentinels, velvet lawns stretched with surgical precision, and chandeliers glimmered in every window as though the light inside never knew exhaustion. Neighbors slowed their cars just to stare. Visitors whispered their names with envy, convinced this family had cracked the code to life, beauty, privilege, prosperity, and power. To the outside world, the Hamiltons had it all. But those who dared to step past the Golden Gates would feel something else entirely. The air grew dense, suffocating, as though the very walls carried secrets they were unwilling to share. It wasn't the kind of silence that soothes. It was the kind that strangles, the kind that clings to your chest until you can't draw a full breath. Inside those polished hallways, there was no laughter spilling from bedrooms, no music drifting through the air, not even the faint hum of casual joy. The house had everything money could buy, but it lacked the one thing that no fortune could manufacture: life. Beneath the shimmer of crystal and the gleam of polished silver, the Hamilton estate was nothing more than a grand stage. Every party, every dinner, every carefully orchestrated smile was a performance. And like all performances, it hid something, a secret that defined every corner of their existence. Their only son, Ethan, was believed to be deaf. Doctors had confirmed it in clinical tones, stamping the diagnosis as fact. His parents, desperate for explanations, accepted it as destiny. And so, little by little, the house surrendered itself to silence. Dinner conversations became muted exchanges of glances. Corridors, though wide enough to echo, carried only the emptiness of absence. Even the grand piano, polished to perfection, sat unplayed, its ivory keys gathering dust like relics of a forgotten past. The Hamiltons had created a fortress of perfection to impress the world, but within its walls their world was quietly unraveling. What made the truth all the more haunting was the contrast. Outside, guests marveled at champagne fountains, dazzling soirees, and endless wealth. Inside, the family lived under a crushing stillness, a silence that reminded them every second of what they had lost, or perhaps what they never truly had. None of the elegant women in gowns or the men in tailored suits sipping whiskey at their parties ever guessed it. Not one could imagine that silence, not money, was the real master of the Hamilton home. Ethan Hamilton was only 3 years old when the verdict came crashing down like a hammer. "Your son is deaf." Those 4 words, delivered by a respected city doctor with the gravity of law, rewrote his life before it had even begun. Richard and Margaret Hamilton, blinded by trust and authority, clung to that diagnosis as though it were sacred scripture. They never questioned it. They never dared. From that moment, Seconde itself became a ghost in their home. The grand piano in the salon went silent, its keys gathering dust beneath the chandelier's glow. Laughter, once free, once reckless, was swallowed whole, replaced with stiff whispers and rehearsed smiles. Servants learned to tread lightly. Conversations became clipped, careful, measured, as if speaking too loud might remind everyone of what was supposedly broken. Ethan grew up inside this cocoon of silence, wrapped not in comfort but in suffocating doubt. Every toy was handed to him wordlessly, every meal served in quiet ritual. His parents' eyes followed him with pity instead of pride, their gestures slow, deliberate, exaggerated, shadows of communication, not its heartbeat. They saw a fragile boy destined for silence. But what they didn't see was the terror growing inside him, the terror that he was trapped in a lie he had no power to undo. By the time he was 6, Ethan had learned to stop pretending. He no longer laughed when the maid dropped a tray. He forced himself not to flinch at thunder. He buried his reactions so deeply that even he began to wonder if maybe the doctors were right. Maybe silence was his destiny. He lived in a mansion filled with chandeliers and polished silver, But inside his chest was an emptiness no luxury could disguise. The Hamiltons believed they were protecting their son. In truth, they were building a prison without bars, a house where wealth shone from every corner, but sound was treated like a curse. And inside that prison, Ethan's childhood was not simply quiet. It was stolen. Years slipped by inside the Hamilton mansion, years where silence reigned like a tyrant. And then Sophie Miller arrived. She was young, unshaken by the grandeur of the house or the whispers about its tragic air. To the Hamiltons, she was just another caretaker, hired to fill a role. But Sophie had something no doctor or parent had ever dared to bring into Ethan's world: doubt. On her first week, the signs came quietly, almost invisible to anyone else. A window slammed shut from a sudden gust, and Ethan flinched, his shoulders tightened, his breath caught. Sophie froze, eyes narrowing. Days later, a dog barked outside the gate. Not just any bark, but sharp, insistent. And for a fraction of a second, Ethan laughed like a boy who had heard a secret joke. Sophie's heart pounded. Children born into silence don't laugh at sound. She watched him closer, now sharper, every hour. One evening, Richard called Ethan's name from across the hall, louder than usual, and Ethan's head snapped around, eyes wide, caught in reflex before he remembered to act deaf. Sophie's suspicion hardened into something else: certainty. The Hamiltons had built a mausoleum for sound, but Sophie was beginning to see the cracks. Each reaction Ethan tried to bury was another clue screaming the truth that the boy could hear, had always been able to hear. Yet he was trapped, playing the role forced on him by authority and fear. Sophie lay awake at night replaying every moment, every startled glance, every smothered giggle. Was this just coincidence? No. Coincidence doesn't explain the way his hands trembled when a plate shattered in the kitchen. Coincidence doesn't explain how his lips curled in sync with the growl of a passing engine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The boy wasn't broken. He was hiding. And the deeper Sophie dug, the more dangerous the truth felt. Because if Ethan could hear, then the entire foundation of the Hamilton family's perfect world was built on a devastating lie. Dinner at the Hamilton mansion was never just a meal. It was theater. Every evening unfolded like a carefully rehearsed play. Crystal glasses stood in perfect formation, lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection. The silver cutlery gleamed beneath the grand chandeliers, polished so thoroughly that you could see your own reflection staring back at you. Each dish was brought out with the same mechanical precision, servants moving in silence as though the absence of sound itself was part of the feast. To sit at that table was to be an audience member as much as a participant, every bite choreographed, every glance rehearsed. But on that night, the performance cracked. It happened in a blink, so fast and yet so devastatingly slow. A servant's hand trembled as he reached across the table, and one fragile crystal glass tipped from the tray. The fall was merciless. The delicate stem hit the marble floor with a sound that didn't belong in the script. A sound sharp, violent, final. The shatter wasn't just a noise, it was a rupture, slicing the air like a gunshot inside a cathedral. Ethan's body betrayed him before his mind could catch up. The boy jolted, his thin shoulders seizing up as if electricity had coursed through his frame. His hands, small and pale, flew instinctively to his ears, his face twisted, eyes wide with panic, lips pulling tight in a grimace of raw fear. It wasn't the reaction of a child startled by clumsiness. It was the reaction of someone caught, someone exposed. For one naked instant, Ethan Hamilton's silence fractured, and the truth bled out. Sophie saw it. She had been watching him for weeks, his stillness, his passivity, the way his parents spoke for him with a certainty that seemed too rigid, too rehearsed. And now, the proof she had half dared to imagine stood undeniable in front of her. Not a guess, not a suspicion whispered in the quiet of her own mind, but truth. A truth louder than the shattering glass. Ethan Hamilton could hear. She didn't dare breathe. Across the table. Richard Hamilton lifted his fork again, calm as ever, cutting into his steak with aristocratic ease. Margaret dabbed at the corner of her lips with her linen napkin, eyes soft with a detachment that looked almost drugged. Their world hadn't shifted. Their dinner hadn't been interrupted. To them. The silence was still intact. They hadn't noticed, or they had chosen not to. Whether blind or willfully ignorant, they kept eating, the illusion of perfection swallowing up reality. Sophie's heart pounded so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. The boy wasn't deaf. He had never been deaf. And yet here he sat, trembling, desperate, his hands pressed to his ears as though that reflex were a crime. She studied him, her chest tightening. His reaction wasn't just fear of a sound. It was fear of discovery, fear of what exposure would mean. Slowly, Ethan lowered his hands. His gaze darted around the room like a trapped animal searching for an escape. And in those eyes, dark, wide, frantic, Sophie saw no relief, no gratitude for the chance to drop the act. Instead, she saw terror, a terror so deep it hollowed him out, left him a prisoner at his own family's table. The dinner resumed. Forks scraped plates with mechanical rhythm. Voices murmured in hushed tones. The performance stitched itself back together as though nothing had broken. But Sophie couldn't swallow another bite. Every chew turned to sand in her mouth. Her mind spun with questions. Who had drilled this act into Ethan? Who had convinced a child that silence was safer than sound? What kind of what kind of fear could bury the truth so thoroughly that even instinct had to be denied? Ethan sat rigid, forcing his hands to stay in his lap, forcing his breath into even shallow waves. He looked like a boy rehearsing how to be invisible. His parents carried on, oblivious or complicit. They smiled and conversed like actors trapped in a play too old to abandon, too costly to rewrite. Sophie realized, with a chill that sank into her bones, it wasn't just the glass that had broken. The fall had split open the facade of the Hamiltons' perfect world. When she excused herself from the table later that night, her head spun. The image of Ethan's trembling shoulders, his desperate eyes, was burned into her memory. The boy's secret had shifted from theory to fact, and with it came a danger she couldn't yet measure. If Ethan could hear, then every diagnosis, every test, every medical file signed with certainty had been built on lies. His entire life had been carved by deceit. Even as she stepped out into the cold night air, Sophie still heard it, the echo of shattering crystal reverberating in her mind. That single sound had undone years of silence. For her, the question was no longer if Ethan could hear. The question was why he had been forced to pretend otherwise, and what price had been paid to keep the lie alive. And Sophie knew, with the same certainty that had stopped her breath at the dinner table, uncovering that truth would not just change Ethan's world. It would unravel the Hamiltons' empires. It would change everything. After the shattering of the crystal glass, Sophie could no longer ignore what she had seen. Ethan's fear had not been the reaction of a child startled by accident. It was the reflex of someone who had spent years training himself to hide the truth. And once Sophie noticed it, she began to see it everywhere, in the corridors. Ethan's eyes darted when a servant coughed too loudly. In the garden. His shoulders stiffened when the wind slammed a gate shut. At dinner, when Richard's fork scraped against porcelain, Sophie caught the quick flicker of panic crossing Ethan's face before he forced it back down. There was a story inside this boy, one his parents refused to read, and Sophie, whether she wanted to or not, was already turning the pages. It happened one rainy afternoon. The storm rattled the windows, thunder rumbling low like a warning. Sophie found Ethan sitting alone in the library. His small frame curled into the corner of an armchair, eyes distant, hands clenched. She sat quietly beside him, offering no words, just presence. For a long time, they listened to the rain together, or at least pretended to. Then Ethan whispered, so softly Sophie almost thought she imagined it. I can hear. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She turned, but Ethan's face was pale, haunted. He gripped the armrest as if confessing might drag him under. I hear everything, he said, voice trembling. The thunder, the footsteps, the glass. But if I tell them... He swallowed, eyes filling with tears. They won't believe me. They'll just call another doctor, and he'll say I'm lying. He'll say I'm broken. The words cracked something inside Sophie. This boy had carried a prison sentence written not by truth, but by fear, and he had been serving it in silence for years. Every laugh he'd suppressed, every startle he'd buried, every word he'd bitten back, it was all part of a performance no child should ever be forced to play. Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice as though the very walls might betray him. If I admit it, if I show them, they'll take it away. The sound, the little freedom I have, it'll all vanish. His breath hitched. So I pretend. I pretend I'm deaf, because pretending is safer than being punished for the truth. Sophie wanted to scream, to march into the grand dining room and expose the lie in front of Richard and Margaret. But when she looked at Ethan's trembling hands, she realized this wasn't about her outrage. It was about his survival. This wasn't a boy who needed proof. This was a boy who needed someone to believe him. From that day, every sound in the Hamilton mansion became something darker. The laughter of guests, the clinking of silverware, the crackle of firewood, it was all backdrop to a forbidden truth. Ethan was not deaf. He never had been. He was a prisoner of expectation, trapped inside a silence designed by mistakes, reinforced by fear, and guarded by the authority of parents who trusted doctors more than their own son. And Sophie, now keeper of his secret, felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. She had uncovered not just a hidden truth, but a dangerous one. Because in the Hamilton home, silence wasn't an absence, it was a command, and Ethan had been obeying it all his life. The night Sophie chose to speak was unlike any other. The Hamilton mansion, usually a fortress of warmth and opulence, seemed to have grown colder with every passing hour. The chandeliers glittered above her head, but their light felt harsh, almost interrogating. Sophie had carried Ethan's secret like a smoldering ember tucked against her heart, a secret that had threatened to ignite everything the moment it slipped from her lips. And now Mayevka... At last, she had reached the point of no return. The truth could no longer be buried. Richard and Margaret Hamilton were seated in the drawing room, a chamber designed less for comfort and more for display. Heavy velvet curtains, dark wood paneling, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, men and women who had built the Hamilton name on discipline, wealth, and an unyielding pride. The couple themselves carried that same air of authority. Richard, with his sharp jaw and commanding presence, looked as though he belonged in a boardroom issuing decrees. Margaret, ever elegant, held her chin high, pearls resting against her neck like a badge of status. When Sophie finally spoke, her voice trembled but did not break. The words that left her lips were small in volume but devastating in impact, slicing through the carefully cultivated silence of the mansion. Ethan can hear. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The crackling fireplace became mute, the ticking of the grandfather clock forgotten. It was as though the house itself held its breath. Then came Richard's response, loud, furious, and disbelieving. His voice thundered against the walls, reverberating through the gilded frames of family portraits. Impossible, Seul, he barked, rising to his feet. We've consulted the finest doctors in the country, years of examination, specialists, reports. Are you calling all of them liars? Margaret gasped, her fingers clutching desperately at her pearls as though the beads might steady her. Her eyes darted nervously toward the staircase. as if Ethan might appear and confirm or deny the unthinkable. Fear rippled across her otherwise polished features, but Sophie stood her ground. She described the moment she had witnessed, how Ethan flinched at sudden noises, how he had laughed softly when he thought no one was listening, how in the quiet of the night he had whispered confessions that betrayed an undeniable truth. Her conviction grew with each word. She was not speculating, she was testifying. Richard would not be undone so easily. He barked orders, summoning a physician at once, this time not just any doctor, but one of the most esteemed specialists in the region, a man whose reputation for precision was nearly mythic. The examination was swift, merciless in its simplicity. A ticking watch was held inches behind Ethan's ear. A sharp clap rang out suddenly in the cavernous parlor, and there it was, Ethan's instinctive reactions, undeniable and raw, his startled gasp, the way his eyes widened, the subtle flinch of his shoulders. Each response struck the Hamiltons like a dagger, cutting through years of denial and certainty. The verdict was inescapable. Ethan's hearing was flawless. The revelation struck Richard like a tidal wave. The man who had commanded empires, crushed rivals, and bent competitors to his will staggered back, robbed of his authority within his own household. Margaret collapsed into tears, clutching her son with a desperation that bordered on hysteria, as though she could erase the years of silence with one trembling embrace. But Ethan did not collapse into her arms. He stood rigid, torn between longing for the comfort of his mother and the bitter sting of betrayal. His childhood, an entire world of laughter, music, and discovery, had been stolen, not by nature's cruelty, but by his parents' blind faith in authority and their obsession with reputation. The truth was crueler than any diagnosis. Ethan had never been broken. He had been silenced by their pride, imprisoned by their refusal to question what they were told. In their hunger to preserve appearances, they had condemned their son to live as a shadow of himself. Sophie stood at the edge of the room, watching it all collapse. She saw the Hamiltons, once the unshakable pillars of their community, stripped of their grandeur, their empire of perfection cracked open, revealing two frightened parents undone by the truth of their own child. And she saw Ethan, for the first time, not as a boy defined by silence, but as a young man stepping into the light of his own voice. That night, the Hamilton mansion no longer resonated with prestige. Its walls no longer whispered of power or discipline. Instead, they trembled with something far more human, the sound of denial breaking, the raw cries of a family forced to face the devastation of what they had done. At first, the change came in whispers. Ethan's voice was shaky, almost foreign to his own ears. A single word at breakfast, a timid laugh at supper. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, afraid the sound might vanish again. But little by little, the boy who had been locked in silence began to claim his voice. One morning, as sunlight streamed across the dining table, Ethan answered Richard's question out loud. His voice cracked, thin but unmistakable. Richard nearly dropped his cup of coffee. Margaret's eyes flooded with tears before the word had even finished leaving her son's lips. And when Ethan laughed, really laughed, it wasn't just his own prison that shattered. It was theirs, too. The Hamiltons moved awkwardly at first, like strangers learning a new language. They had spent so many years speaking in hushed tones and careful glances that true conversation felt dangerous. But guilt has a way of teaching quickly. Richard forced himself to ask questions not about duty or manners, but about Ethan's thoughts, his feelings. Margaret began to listen, not with pity, but with trembling awe, and Ethan responded. His words came halting at first, but soon cascaded with years of dammed-up curiosity. He wanted to know everything: why the rain made the roof sing, why the piano keys sounded different under strong fingers, why laughter could echo and stretch through walls. Every discovery was a revelation, and his parents were forced to realize they were witnessing not just their son growing, but their son beginning. The mansion itself seemed to stir awake. The grand piano, long silent, was opened. Sophie pressed the first chord, and Ethan's head tilted back in wonder at the sound. Soon. He dared to try himself, striking the keys with a mixture of fear and delight. Music swelled through the halls where silence had once suffocated. Servants no longer tiptoed. They smiled as laughter chased them down corridors. Even the walls, once heavy and oppressive, seemed to breathe again for Richard and Margaret. Every sound became both miracle and accusation. Each giggle reminded them of what they had stolen. Each question cut deep into the years they had wasted. But instead of retreating into shame, they clung to the chance to rebuild. They apologized over and over, sometimes in words, sometimes in tears. They learned to listen not only to what Ethan said, but to what he meant, what he feared, what he dreamed. Ethan, once the silent heir, said, was no longer a ghost in his own home. He was alive, loud, messy, curious, and with every laugh, every word, every clumsy question, the Hamiltons began to understand. They had not just regained a son, they had been given him for the first time. The Hamilton mansion, once a shrine to wealth and appearances, transformed into something far rarer. It became a home, not a fortress of silence, but a sanctuary of sound filled with footsteps, with conversation, with the fragile, crystal, miraculous music of a boy's stolen childhood finally returned. In the end, it wasn't the doctors with their white coats, endless charts and sterile remedies, nor the Hamilton fortune with its gilded influence and whispered power, nor even the slow and indifferent passage of time that saved the family from collapse. No, salvation arrived in a form nobody had anticipated. Sophie. She was an outsider, a woman with no claim to their bloodline, no stake in their empire of wealth, no reason to risk her own peace for theirs. And yet she was the one who walked through those towering oak doors, polished to a shine that reflected centuries of Hamilton pride, and dared to ask the questions that everyone else had been too afraid to speak aloud. When the town dismissed Ethan as broken, labeling him a son lost to silence, Sophie refused to accept it. She believed in him when belief seemed inconvenient, when hope came at a cost, when her faith looked less like optimism and more like foolishness. She believed anyway. That stubborn, almost reckless faith lit a spark powerful enough to burn through decades of denial, pride, and self-imposed silence. The Hamilton mansion, once the crown jewel of the town, had, for decades, ceased to be a home. It was less a dwelling than a mausoleum, a cavernous museum dressed in velvet curtains, dripping chandeliers, and oil portraits meant to intimidate and project power. Behind those marble walls, wealth had hardened into shackles, pride had become a suffocating mask, and silence had been sharpened into a weapon. But now, for the first time in living memory, the house seemed to breathe. Laughter, a sound long exiled from those corridors, came bouncing down the hallways that had grown accustomed only to whispers. Music, fragile, hesitant, yet undeniably alive, slipped from the grand piano in the drawing room, creeping into corners that had forgotten the touch of melody. Conversations spilled across dinner tables, overlapping and imperfect, alive with human warmth instead of rehearsed civility. The hush that once smothered the mansion had finally lifted, replaced by something louder, messier, and infinitely more beautiful: life. Richard Hamilton, the Iron Patriarch who once barked orders with military precision, now leaned in close just to catch the subtle inflections in his son's halting voice. Margaret, the matriarch whose unbending pride had for years kept curtains drawn tight and questions unspoken, let her tears fall freely as Ethan's laughter rang through the air. To her, it wasn't just sound, it was a hymn, a melody she had feared she would never hear again. The galas, the polished silver, the reputation that once consumed her, every ounce of it melted into irrelevance. What mattered now was Ethan. His voice, raw and unpolished, was proof that love does not wait for perfection. It begins the very moment denial ends. And Sophie? She stood quietly at the center of it all. She had not entered like a savior wielding miracles or demanding recognition. She had no crown, no title, ego, no banner of triumph. She simply listened. She listened when doctors rolled their eyes and dismissed Ethan's chances, when his parents retreated into the safety of silence, when neighbors whispered rumors behind closed doors. She noticed the faint signs others ignored. She leaned into faith when doubt seemed safer. That quiet, invisible choice cracked the fortress of marble and gold, revealing something far greater, the fragile, pulsing humanity buried beneath decades of performance. Ethan himself, once a ghost in his own home, once hiding behind silence like a shadow, now claimed his birthright. He laughed without shame. He spoke without hesitation. He sang with a voice that belonged wholly, unapologetically to him. It wasn't just a child rediscovering sound. It was an anthem, a triumphant declaration that a family once frozen in grief and arrogance had been reborn. His words carried the force to undo years of isolation, to prove that a single voice, once freed, could shake the very foundations of a dynasty. The Hamilton estate no longer loomed over the town like a fortress of exclusion. Its gates no longer whispered of privilege and distance. Slowly, it became what a home was meant to be, a place where love rose louder than fear, where sound was not a curse but a gift. And each echo of Ethan's laughter was a reminder that the silence they had worshipped all those years had been nothing more than a gilded lie. History, people often say, is rewritten by armies, by wealth, by the clash of nations. But sometimes, history is remade by a single soul brave enough to see what others cannot. Sophie was that soul. She believed when belief looked foolish, carried hope when everyone else surrendered, and loved when love required sacrifice. Because of her, Ethan's story no longer belonged to the shadows. His future stretched before him, unbound, limitless, alive. And in the end, the truth revealed itself in its purest, simplest form. When trusted, it has the power to alter destinies. Faith, even in the smallest, most fragile voice, can do more than rescue a child. It can redeem an entire family. It can take a legacy built on silence and transform it into one that resounds with love, courage, and the kind of joy that refuses to be silenced ever again. Ethan's stolen childhood, Sophie's courage, and the Hamiltons' redemption remind us how truth can shatter silence. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Hit like, share with others, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful, life-changing stories.